If you're brand new to graphite and charcoal, or just looking to improve your drawing skills, allow me to show you all of the important things you need to know to get started. I respect your time, so let's get straight into it. In this video, we'll take a look at some of the best possible materials and tools to use so that you're off to the best possible start. We'll also take a quick look at some easy and effective methods and techniques and how to apply those skills to your drawings. This video is jam-packed with really helpful information throughout, as well as extra info in the description. But let's now take a look at some of my absolute favourite materials and tools to use. Let's start with the drawing surface. So the first paper we have here is the Bristol Smooth from Strathmore, which you may recognise as it's a very popular choice among graphite artists for its incredibly smooth surface. Artists often choose this paper as graphite pencils are able to easily create clean lines and smooth gradients without worrying about any unwanted texture or graininess. So for example, human portraits look great on this sort of paper. However, if you're choosing to work in both graphite and charcoal, then the Fabriano Classico 5 is another great choice. It's still quite a smooth surface, but it has a slight texture which allows it to grip onto the charcoal as well. Incorporating charcoal into your graphite artworks allows you to achieve a much deeper and darker value, improving contrast and a sense of depth within your pieces. We'll talk a lot more about that in this video soon. Switching our focus to the drawing materials, the Faber-Castell 9000 series are one of my strong favourites for general graphite pencil use. They're relatively inexpensive while remaining very high quality. In this set you can see they come in a wide variety by going from 5H all the way to 5B. And don't worry if you're confused about the pencil grading, I'll explain all about that in a little bit. I also just love the quality of this metal case they come in, which makes it very easy to store neatly away, and it's very compact, so easy to travel with too. The next set of pencils I have here are also from Faber-Castell, and these are the Pitt Graphite Matte. These also come in a compact high quality metal case, but they're a bit more specialised compared to the 9000 series. As the name suggests, the Pitt Graphite Matte have a less shiny finish when compared to typical graphite pencils. You can see these go all the way to a grade of 12B, able to achieve much darker values than other graphite pencils for that strong contrast, which is something that I personally really appreciate. Lastly here, for my other favourite graphite pencils, these are the Mars Lumograph Black. These can achieve an even darker value than the Pitt Graphite Matte while still working very well with and complementing normal graphite layers. You can use all three different types of pencils in the same artwork as they can all layer and combine nicely together. The Mars Lumograph Black, to my knowledge, can achieve the darkest value for any graphite pencil, but we can always go a step further by opting to use charcoal pencils. My favourite charcoal pencils to use are from a US brand called Generals, and they come in 3 strengths of medium, soft and extra soft. Again, I'll also explain this grading very soon. Charcoal pencils are great to use with graphite pencils as long as you layer them correctly, and I'll usually reserve these for the very darkest values within a graphite drawing. To achieve a strong contrast and sense of depth, you'll need to be able to put down very dark values, which is what the charcoal pencils allow for. So moving on from the pencils, I also like to use compressed charcoal sticks. You can see this particular set is assorted in a gradient from dark to light, and there's many different ways that you can apply these to your artworks. You can draw with them directly on your paper, or for example you can scrape off the dust to create a very smooth layer once blended out. Again, I'll be able to show you an example of this in much more detail very soon. So let's talk about some of the tools that can help us, and first up here we have some firm makeup brushes of different sizes. Again, these are very cheap to get hold of, and this is just a random set that I found off Amazon. You don't need anything fancy at all. I find that makeup brushes are great for blending out both graphite and charcoal, as they offer a really smooth layer which can be hard to achieve with other tools. I typically use these brushes for broader areas, but having different sizes to choose from and also reach smaller areas can be really handy too. I personally like to go for makeup brushes that are a bit on the firmer side, as it just gives a bit more control on how I blend things out. Another tool I love to use for blending graphite and charcoal are paper blending stumps. Again, very cheap and easy to get a hold of, and they also last a long time too. These particular blending stumps are great for smaller and more detailed areas, as the tip is quite pointy, so you have more of that precise control. And as you're blending an area with this tool, the pigments will start to become embedded into the tip, which you can then do a sort of transfer method which transforms this tool into a sort of big blurry pencil. I can explain more about some of these methods and techniques very soon. When it comes to erasing, one of my go-tos is the Faber-Castell kneadable eraser. You can mold this into any shape that you want, so it's very handy, for example, if you need to mold it into a thin shape, which you can then get into hard to reach areas, or even erasing some texture into a graphite layer for highlights, for example. There's many different use cases with this kneadable eraser, and again, they're very cheap and easy to get a hold of, so I always recommend having a few around. In terms of actual traditional erasers, I use these less often, but they're still handy to have around. So first here I have the Faber-Castell latex-free eraser, which works great. And I also love to use their green dust-free eraser, as it can be less messy. I typically use these for last resort erasing any mistakes or errors, but they can also be great for creating texture if needed too. Both erasers are very high quality. If you've watched any of my graphite tutorials already, you'll know that I love to use eraser pencils. You can see that these are just like ordinary pencils, however, instead of graphite or a charcoal core, we have a soft rubber eraser core. So I love to use this particular one from Faber-Castell, and another particular favourite of mine is the Koh-i-Noor eraser pencil. As well as reaching small areas, these are vital in my practice for erasing fur or hair highlight texture or any other small highlight details. For all of the materials and tools that you see here in this video, I'll leave some helpful links where you can find them in the video description. And lastly here, if you want to get really precise and have very crisp, clean erasing lines, then the Tombow Mono Eraser is a really great asset to have in your arsenal. It sort of works like a mechanical pencil, but instead of thin graphite sticks on the inside, you can see that we instead have these thin rubber cores. Again, this tool is excellent at creating thin detailed highlight texture when needed. I'll now show you some easy and helpful methods and techniques, and then we can take a look at some of the skills we've learned and how to apply them to our drawings. Let's first take a look at the difference between lower and higher graphite pencil grades. So using the Faber-Castell 9000 pencils, I'm first drawing lines here with the 2B grade pencil. You can see these lines are very fine and thin and not too bold. Moving on to the 4B, these lines are a little bolder because as we move up the pencil grade, there's more graphite mixed in with the binder in the pencil core. So then when we draw in lines with the 6B pencil, the lines are even thicker and bolder again because of an even higher graphite to binder ratio in the core. The same works for charcoal pencils with their grading going from medium to extra soft. Here first using the medium, then I'll use the soft and then finish with the extra soft. Again, the grades correlate to how much charcoal is mixed with a binder in the core. I would say that there's less of a difference with the charcoal pencil grades compared to the wide range that we usually get from graphite pencil sets. Nevertheless, having a slightly less or more opaque charcoal pencil really does come in handy when you want your dark values to be less or more intense. Let's now take a look at some of the different blending methods for graphite that we can use. So first here I'm just shading in a small rectangular area with the 2B Faber-Castell 9000, and then I'll go over this in 3 light layers so that it's nice and evenly covered in pigment. So the first blending method I'll test here is with a paper blending stump, so I'll be using a light to medium pressure and essentially just going evenly from side to side. I typically reserve this tool for smaller and hard to reach areas as we have that nice pointy tip to work with. As you can see, it does a good job at blending out the graphite, but we do have a few patches where things just aren't as smooth, and that is just the nature of this tool. Again, it's not really ideal for large spread out areas, but it's really great in small precise sections. But as you can see, it has blended out the graphite quite nicely with relative ease. However, one of my favourite things about this tool is its ability to transfer over embedded pigments. You can see by just using the pigments embedded into the tip of the tool, I'm able to create a whole new shaded area underneath like so. I can draw in any marks and they come out as if drawn by a big blurry pencil. Depending on how dark the initial area is that you blended with this tool, you can transfer over even darker pigments if that's what you need. I always find a lot of use cases for this transfer method, so I would consider this tool a must-have for graphite and charcoal artworks. If we take a quick look at this snippet from my graphite and charcoal puppy tutorial, you can see how I'm able to pick up the charcoal pigments from a scrap piece of paper and then use that same transfer method with the paper blending stump tool to apply these darker marks to my artwork where needed. Again, the transfer method with this particular tool is great for thicker and less defined marks as it sort of acts like a big blurry pencil. Moving on, I'll quickly shade in another small rectangular area, again with the 2B graphite pencil, but this time we will blend out the area using a small and firm makeup brush. Compared to the previous tool, these makeup brushes are excellent at larger and broader areas. Using a light pressure, you can see how quick and easy it is to achieve a smooth blended out result, and you can also subtly use this to transfer embedded pigments to new areas also. Not as intense as the transfer from the blending stump, but still very useful for certain subtle use cases. Lastly here again, just shading in an area with the 2B pencil. For the largest and broadest of areas, I also love to use just an ordinary kitchen paper towel. Typically I'll use a medium pressure when blending out with one of these, and as you can see we can achieve a very smooth and even result. Again, if needed, you can use the embedded pigments to softly shade in an area nearby too. This is now a nice natural leeway to some of the eraser tools, so here I can quickly show you how some of these eraser pencils perform. So this white eraser pencil here is the Koh-i-Noor Hardmouth, and the pencil with the pink tip is the Faber-Castell Perfection. Both are very similar and work great, and I always have them nearby when creating graphite or charcoal artworks. Another great eraser is the Tombow Mono Eraser, and as you can see just how thin of a line this tool is able to create out of the graphite, so perfect for things like hair highlights or any other fine details. And lastly here for the erasers, I'll just quickly show you the Faber-Castell Traditional Eraser, which is great for things like large corrections or highlights, and the much loved Kneadable Eraser. The Kneadable Eraser is another great addition to have in your collection, a lot of really handy use cases due to being able to mold into different shapes and sizes. So next I would like to quickly walk you through some of the fundamental graphite pencil skills, such as creating smooth gradients at different values. For now we'll be only using our graphite pencils, but we can take a look at some of the charcoal fundamentals later on in this video. So to illustrate, I'll be shading in a sphere with the aim of showing you how to achieve a smooth, realistic 3D shape using our graphite pencils and blending tools. These methods and techniques can easily transfer to skin or any other smooth texture that you may be aiming to create in your own future artworks. So keeping things relatively simple here, I'm only going to use grades F and B from the 9000 series, and first here to shade in this first layer I'm using the lighter F grade. I like to work gradually and build up the layers no matter what media I'm using, so starting with subtle and then work my way up to more intense and defined as I work through the layers. Here you can see I'm holding my pencil quite a bit further back, and this is allowing me to achieve long sweeping motions, which makes shading in a lot more efficient. And it also allows just for a very light pressure where the tip of the pencil is sort of just gliding along the surface of the paper. So as mentioned, I'm using the F grade here for this first layer of the sphere, and you can see I've nearly finished lightly shading in the overall area. However, a tiny bit more emphasis has been placed on where the shadows are going to go around to the left side. So once the layer is shaded into place, I can then go ahead and use my makeup brush to softly blend all of that out for a nice, even and smooth starting layer. When using the makeup brush, I make sure to use a light, even pressure throughout, as pressing too hard could cause some blotchy or patchy issues. So now starting work on the second layer, I'm using the slightly darker B grade pencil. I want to build upon that first layer, first enhancing those shadows to the left side of the sphere to begin forming that 3D shape. So when looking at this chart, we can see that the F grades are lighter than the B grades, and even though there's only a slight difference between the F and the B, we can still use different pressures for different opacities. So if I press harder with my pencil, no matter what grade it is, it will achieve a darker and more opaque mark. Obviously this becomes more intense and darker the further down the B grades you go. So again, using my pressures here, I'm applying more pressure to the very edges where we have an even darker value within the shadows. And then as I'm shading further towards that lighter center where the light is hitting, I'm easing off that pressure so that I'm shading in a lighter and more subtle value. This second layer already helps to illustrate how useful using different pressures with your pencil is, as I'm able to achieve a much darker result just from pressing down a little more using the same pencil. So as our sphere begins to form here, the difference between the darker and the lighter graphite values is what creates that 3D illusion, tricking our brains into seeing an object with real depth on the flat paper. This contrast in value is what allows us to perceive lifelike and convincing depth. So once I'm happy with the placement of the second layer, I can go ahead and again pick up my makeup brush to smooth all of the graphite out and incorporate the two layers together. If you've ever watched any of my other tutorials, whether it's graphite or soft pastel, you'll know that I prefer to gradually build up the layers. I much prefer a slow and steady approach as I feel like it produces the best results. So I'll just quickly continue to softly and evenly blend this layer out before moving on to the next layer. Remember, we'll have embedded pigments in the brush, so the more I brush in those darker shadowed areas, the more these embedded pigments will also slightly darken that area. So here I can just quickly notice a few slightly darker patches, so to correct that and keep everything looking smooth, I'm just going to very lightly dab on top with a kneadable eraser just to lift off some of that excess. Once everything is blended and smooth, I can go ahead with my third layer and again repeat the same process of darkening the shadows and easing off the pressure as I come into that central area. Notice how I don't have to use a darker grey pencil, I can just apply more pressure to deposit more of the pigment with the pencil that I already have. As I'm working through the layers, I'm gradually intensifying those shadows one step at a time. Again, I like to build up the layers with increasing intensity and definition, starting with basic and ending up with refined. And this is typically the same for any media I work with. As I want a more enhanced shadow for these final few layers, I'm also going to blend with the paper blending stump. As mentioned, this tool will be more intense and opaque compared to the brush, but that's what I'm looking for when it comes to the slightly more intense shadowed areas at the very edges. Also, the precision with this tool is really handy as the very edge of the sphere is quite a precise area to blend out, so I can switch between this tool and the makeup brush as needed. So I'll just quickly continue with this layer, enhancing the shadow even more and extending it a little further into the center. I want to make sure that this gradient from dark to light not only has a smooth gradual transition, but also that it's even around the sphere for that realistic 3D effect. I'm then just going to quickly use the Tombow mono eraser to clean up the edges, and then I'm going to draw in this surface shadow at the very bottom. This will just be a very dark shadow that situates this sphere on a surface, so I can shade in with a darker 4B or 6B pencil, with the darker shadow value being closest to the sphere itself, and then some slightly lighter values towards the far end of the shadow. Again, I'll be constantly adjusting my pressure depending on how dark I need these values to be. So then to blend out this more intense surface shadow, I can just stick with the blending stump and makeup brush as needed, and then I'll also just make some final adjustments to the shadow on the sphere itself before moving on. Hopefully you can see how quick and easy that was, and if you practice this yourself a few times, I think that it would be really helpful to understand not only the different pencil grades, but how to produce 3D forms and smooth blended textures. So I'll just quickly go through showing you the exact same process done again, but using darker grade pencils for a darker sphere. Feel free to just watch the process, or why not give it a go alongside me. If you're ever learning a new media such as graphite, pastels, oil paint, or whatever it is, practicing your fundamentals such as drawing in these 3D spheres is really helpful in allowing you to get used to the materials and tools. So if you would also like to have a go at drawing your own spheres alongside me in this video, then you are more than welcome to. So there we have it, another sphere using the exact same methods and techniques, but this time with darker grade pencils. If we put them side by side here, we can see the difference, but I hope that this demonstration was helpful for you in understanding value, depth, and smooth textures. So let's now take a look at how we can transfer some of those skills over to some drawings. So first up here, we can take a look at my nice and easy nose and mouth study to get us started. I'll speed through the process here while explaining, but if at any time you would like to watch the full tutorial, you can find it on my Patreon along with many others, which is linked in the description. So as explained previously, I love to work in gradual layers, slowly building up the definition and detail. The first few layers are just about getting the whole area organized and mapped out, so I'll first focus on some of the darkest areas such as the nostrils, the skin crease lines and the gaps between the teeth and so on. For this I can use a darker grey pencil, but remember I can always build upon and enhance in future layers if needed. To begin shading in for the skin, just like with the previous spheres, I can start with a lower grade pencil while I start to figure out the values in each of the sections, and then as I work through the layers, I can enhance those values further, either by pressing harder with the same pencil or just by choosing a darker grade pencil. Again, I can blend with both my makeup brush and a paper blending stump, depending on what sort of area needs to be blended and how. The brush is obviously great for smooth, soft skin, and then the blending stump is great for the smaller and more intense areas. And once I'm happy with some of those initial layers, and I think that all of the sections look correct when comparing to the reference image, I can draw in more layers on top to enhance and refine even further. As I start to finish and come to some of the final layers, I can start using my precise eraser tools to pick off some of those highlights, in this study such as the teeth in particular. But this is where I would also highlight final hair strands, for example. And talking of hair, let's now take a look at how we can draw hair with graphite. Human hair is actually one of my favourite things to draw with graphite, as you can easily achieve super intricate details. So again, here you can see I have my materials ready, as well as all of the outlines before I begin. So again, to start, my first objective is to get the whole area organised and mapped out, and I'll do that by focusing on some of the darkest areas and shadows first. The hair study you're watching here is from a full in-depth tutorial on my Patreon, where I also show you some other great graphite pencils to have in your collection. In this study, I'm also using the Pitt Graphite Matte pencils as well as the Lumograph Black, and if I pull up this chart here, you can see just how dark they can get in comparison to the normal 9000 graphite series. So you can see once those darkest shadows are in place, I can then just sort of shade in the whole area to give it its darker value, and once the whole area is covered with graphite, I can then use some erasing tools to erase away this darker value in certain areas, and this is what will create the highlights. So then it's just a case of enhancing the darker and lighter values in those final layers, really aiming to push the contrast as much as possible for that really realistic and tangible sense of depth within the hair. This is also without any charcoal, but you can see just how useful the Pitt Graphite Matte and the Mars Lumograph Black are at achieving those very dark values here. So let's now push it a step further and take a look at how we can draw a whole human portrait with graphite. So this human portrait you see here is from another in-depth tutorial from my Patreon, but I'll just quickly walk you through some of the process and steps taken now. With portraits, I typically like to start with some important areas such as the eyes and then carry on from there. So exactly like with the spheres, I'm shading in using a light pressure using sweeping motions with lower grade pencils for the skin, while also at the same time choosing some of those darker grade pencils for darker features such as the eyelid, iris, pupil and so on. Again, the makeup brush is perfect for blending out really soft and smooth looking skin texture, so as long as I work in light gradual layers with my graphite pencils and evenly blend with the makeup brush as I go along, the skin will remain looking soft and realistic. The forehead is a very similar area to the spheres, where we have those slightly darker values at the edges, and then we have that lighter value in the middle where the light is hitting. Luckily with graphite we only have our values to worry about, as things become a lot more complicated when you add colour in. As we move on to the body, this can be quite tricky with graphite as it's a relatively large, flat and untextured area of smooth skin. So to achieve this, I again make sure to gradually build up the layers by drawing in long sweeping motions, and as this is such a broad area, I'm mostly opting to use some kitchen towels to blend. You can see after a few layers that I'm able to not only achieve a large area of smooth skin, but also those deep dark values where needed, such as the arm crease for example, really aiming to push that contrast as much as possible so that we have that strong sense of depth. This is usually one of the main focuses, as graphite artworks can often look quite flat without those really dark values. Again, drawing the hair, I'm starting from simple beginnings and then slowly but surely refining the detail and definition as I work through those layers. This tutorial in particular is really helpful as it teaches you not only how to achieve the smooth soft texture of the skin, but also the fine texture details of the hair in one lesson. Once you're able to understand the basics and the fundamentals of graphite, as well as the steps taken throughout this process, you'll be able to draw anyone that you would like to in a realistic style. And if you're interested in creating even more texture with graphite, I of course have a tutorial for that too. Here is a small and easy line study I created for my patron students with the aim of achieving lots of animal fur texture with deep contrast. So again, my process is to start out with a simple mapping out stage just to first establish some of those darker values and details straight away. I'll then just essentially shade in all over with the graphite pencils, and then the magic for the fur texture comes in when we start to use our eraser tools to create those fur highlights. Once that graphite base layer is in place for the fur, it's then time to use eraser tools and start to also map out the flow direction of the fur. This is important to give structure to the lion's face. And once I have established where those highlights are to go, it's then just a matter of refining the darker and lighter values as I work through the layers and continuing to build up the definition as I go along. In particular, the eraser pencils are great for fur details as we have the super detailed pointy tip to work with. We can just sort of etch the fur highlights right out of the graphite base layers, and then use the darker graphite pencils around those highlights to enhance the contrast even further. So those artworks were created using graphite only, but let's now take a look at introducing charcoal too. I personally love a strong contrast within my artworks, and charcoal with its deep dark value is perfect for achieving that. To illustrate, let's create some gradient swatches. So the first one on the left will be with graphite only, and then the one on the right is where we will repeat the same process but introduce charcoal pencils for a darker value. And if you're brand new to graphite, I think that creating these gradient swatches are an excellent way at practicing some of your values, while also aiming to create these all-important smooth transitions from the dark to the light. So as I'm shading in, I'm applying more pressure at either end for that darker value, and I'm leaving the middle with the lightest touch. So I'm opting for slightly darker pencil grades as I work through the multiple layers. Again, I love to use a slow and steady step-by-step approach to gradually build up to that darker value. I'll then lastly blend with my makeup brush to incorporate the layers together while blending the graphite for that smooth, even transition. So now let's repeat the same process to the right here and create our darker gradient. Here I've kicked things off with a 2B graphite pencil before introducing the charcoal pencil. Again, charcoal and graphite work great when layered together, so a base layer of graphite beforehand will work great here. So when starting with the charcoal pencil, you can see that I can draw just like I did with the graphite, but even with the lightest of pressures, the charcoal is still going to be quite dark, so you just need to be a little careful in the lighter areas. So here, when the gradient fades into that lighter value in the middle, for example, I'm barely letting the tip glide along the surface and we're still getting those subtle dark values. So typically when using charcoal in an artwork, I will only reserve it for the mid-tone or darkest areas for this reason. It's going to be difficult to add in a lighter value with the charcoal, so I just reserved that for the graphite only. However, I can continue to blend out the charcoal with my makeup brush just like how I do with the graphite. The only real difference is that it may just produce a little bit of dust which you can blow away. So not only can you add charcoal on top of the graphite, but you can also draw graphite on top of the charcoal, which is what I'm going to do here. This will also help to sort of seal the layers together so that everything is incorporated nicely. By its nature, charcoal may require more time and effort to make it appear smooth in a gradient like this. You can see there are small gaps that have been left behind from shading in with the charcoal pencil, but by using the graphite on top like so can help to even out the gaps and make the gradient appear smoother. So hopefully this just helps to illustrate how charcoal and graphite can be used well together. Both are not only compatible with each other, but are able to complement one another, which is why I love to use both graphite and charcoal in the same artwork. To demonstrate how well charcoal and graphite pair together, let's take a quick look at my ear study tutorial from Patreon. Again, if you'd like to watch any of the tutorials you see here in full, you can find the link to my Patreon in the description. So straight away here, going in with the big guns, using the charcoal pencil for the super deep dark value that we see for the hair behind the ear. I'll then use my paper blending stump to blend all of that out. Next, I'm focusing on the ear itself, using both graphite and charcoal to establish some of the darkest and mid-tone areas, just starting with a basic mapping out stage which I will then build upon with more layers. You can now see that process play out, and hopefully you can see just how good charcoal is at creating those all important deep dark values for this study. And as I come to some of the final stages, I'm using my eraser tools to enhance those highlights as well. And this strong contrast between the very dark values and our bright highlights is what's going to give us that strong realistic sense of depth that I love to create. So let's take it a step further and take a look at my new Sleepy Puppy tutorial from Patreon. This is quite an in-depth lesson, so I'll speed through it quicker, but I just want to show you my process of using both graphite and charcoal to create realistic animal fur with lots of contrast and depth. So again, I first established some of the dark areas of the puppy itself to get started, but as you just seen, this portrait has a blanket on which the puppy rests on. So for this, I'm using compressed charcoal sticks and scraping off the dust to where I need it to be. I can then blend this out to create a really nice smooth layer to work upon, which is obviously great for large soft areas such as this blanket. Then switching back to the graphite, I'm able to build up the soft definition by enhancing the dark and light values on top in gradual layers. So when shifting my focus back onto the puppy itself, I'm going to first blend out where I establish some of those darkest areas, and then I'm going to begin with my first overall layers. I'll mainly be shading in with the graphite pencil all over, figuring out where the dark, mid and light values go. It's important that I get the correct positioning of all the values, as this will start to form the 3D structure of the puppy's face. Once I'm happy with how those sections are looking, it's then just a matter of enhancing and refining further as I build up the layers before adding in the fur texture details on top. You can see I'm also using compressed charcoal as well as the charcoal pencils here for that lovely smooth deep dark value that we can achieve. Again, with all my graphite artworks, I'm really looking for a strong contrast so that the image has a lot of depth. I'll blend everything and then begin really enhancing those dark features such as the nose and eye area, mostly by using charcoal pencils. Once the features are refined and I'm happy with them, I can then start creating the fur texture on top. This will be achieved by a mixture of using eraser pencils for the fur highlights, while also enhancing the dark gaps between the highlighted fur. When drawing animal fur, it's really important to always check the reference image for the flow direction of the fur in a particular area, as well as how long each of the hairs are and what sort of a gap to leave between each of those highlights. More gaps between the highlighted fur hairs correlate to a lower fur density, whereas less gaps correlate to a higher fur density. I obviously go into this process in a lot more detail in the Patreon tutorial, but hopefully this has given you a good overview of the process. So that's it for this puppy overview, but I would like to show you one final tutorial, and this is my graphite and charcoal rose study, again from my Patreon, but I would like to play this for you in full to end this video here on YouTube. I just want to quickly say thank you very much so far for watching this video, and I'll pop back in again at the very end. In the meantime, please enjoy this tutorial if you have the time, and feel free to check the description for any other helpful graphite and charcoal information and resources. Before we begin, I'll now quickly walk you through the materials. So first up we have the Fabriano Classico 5, which is a watercolour paper with a slight texture, perfect for gripping onto the charcoal. The charcoal pencils I'm using is from Generals, which is a small company based in the USA. They only have 3 different grades, medium soft and extra soft, but that's all I'll need. For the graphite pencils, I'll be using the Pitt Graphite Matte series, which are great as they produce reduced shine compared to normal graphite pencils, and I'll also be using the Mars Lumograph Black, which are the darkest graphite pencils I own, perfect for the high level of contrast that I'm aiming for today. For blending, I'll be using some of these cheap and soft makeup brushes for some of the background, and for the rose itself, I'll be using my trusty paper blending stumps. I'll also be using paper towels with my blending stumps, which is something I'll explain in the upcoming tutorial. And lastly, to erase, I'll be using my kneadable eraser to bring out some of the highlights, and for the important details or to correct small areas, I'll be using the Precise Koh-i-Noor eraser pencil. So the very first thing I want to do is to block in that really dark background, because you can see how effective it is at contrasting with the highlights of the rose. So as you can see, I've gone straight in with the charcoal pencil and I've just aimed to lightly shade in the whole area, so using a very light pressure and just trying to create an even smooth layer of charcoal. And then I'm going to blend this out with my blending stump. Now this background process especially is going to be a little bit sped up just because there's not too much to explain, and the blocking in stage does take take a lot of valuable time. So instead of making you watch it all the way through in real time, I thought I would make the tutorial more concise. And then if you want to watch the full uninterrupted real-time process, you can find that video linked in the description. But for this tutorial, you will notice that it does speed through quite a bit. And that's just so that we can get quickly stuck into the more important parts that we want to learn. So once that layer of charcoal is blended out, I'm then going to draw a smooth layer on top with the Pit Graphite Matte, and I'm using the grade 3B. Now, if you want a more smooth finish and you want to avoid any graininess within the paper, then I would suggest probably using the graphite first, blending that out, and then maybe adding a light even layer of charcoal on top of that, or maybe just even sticking with dark graphite pencils. So working your way up, maybe using a 3B first, and then the Pit Graphite Matte can go all the way up to 14B, so maybe finishing with a 14B, and perhaps even the Mars Lumograph Black on top of that as well. And if you slowly work through the dark pencil grades like that, using the graphite pencil sets that can achieve deep dark values such as the Mars Lumograph Black and the Pit Graphite Matte, you will likely achieve the smoothest and least grainiest background. But for this purpose, I've just gone straight in with the charcoal first, just so we can get that deep dark value straight away. And I personally don't really mind the graininess for this study as it's not the main subject, and going straight in with the charcoal just saves a bit of time. But I thought I would just mention, if you did want to have a less grainy background, then I would slowly work up with those graphite only pencils instead. Okay, so I'm now using the soft makeup brush to gently blend and incorporate those graphite pigments together on top of the charcoal layer. And while this does smooth things out and make things a little bit more even, you can see it can get quite dusty using the makeup brush like this. So what I have next to me is just this blowing device, which is used mainly for dust in keyboards and stuff like that, but I find that it works really well for graphite and soft pastel dust when you need to get it off the paper. You can also just blow on the paper, but be careful not to get any dust into your lungs. So as you can see, I'm now switching to using my Mars Lumograph Black pencils, and I'm first using the HB grade for some of the lighter areas, and then I'm going to switch to using the darker 7B grade, and I'm mainly going to focus this darker pigment in the corners, because on the reference photo you can see the central area of the background is lighter compared to the corners, and this also creates quite a nice effect for the study as well. So that's why I'm using this darker pencil in those corners. So to shade with these pencils, I'm making sure to use a light even pressure, and I'm trying not to rush any step because I do want it to be relatively smooth. I don't want it to be too blotchy. So I'm just going to take my time with light circular motions to build up that layer. And again, if you want to watch any of this background creation process in more detail, you can find the real-time process video linked in the description. Okay, so now to draw the rose itself, I'm going to pick up my charcoal pencil, and this is the soft 4B grade. And all I'm going to do straight away is block in that very dark stalk that we can see in the reference. And you can see that it's just pitch black. There's no detail or definition. We just have that dark shape. So we obviously have those two small thorns as well, which I'll add in. And you can see by adding this in straight away that it kind of sets a precedent for the darkest value. So even though the background looked quite dark straight away on the white paper, now that we have that really dark stalk in place, we can get a sense of just how deep our values can go. And this is where the high level of contrast is going to come into play, because even though our background is relatively dark, using the charcoal pencils can really push those deep and dark values to achieve that strong sense of contrast within this study. So now I'm just quickly switching to the HB Mars Lumograph Black, and that's just to draw in the lighter gaps which are left around that dark stalk. So I'm just making sure to incorporate the background to make it look as though it's all the way behind the stalk and that there's not any white gaps left around it. So switching back to the 4B soft charcoal pencil, I'm going to start on the rose petals themselves, and I'm simply just going to draw in these darker values where I can see it almost black on the reference image. So we have this small section here immediately above the stalk, and then I'm going to follow that around and pick up where those darkest values are on some of the surrounding petals as well. And this is just to start to map out the area, to just start working out where the deepest values are straight away, and then we can sort of work around those. So I'm applying less pressure here and just lightly shading because it's more of a mid-tone shadow, and then as I move down to the bottom petal you can see those really dark shadows to the sides and the edges. So here I can press harder and make sure that I get those really deep and dark values in place. But when we come to those areas which aren't as jet black and they're more sort of a dark grey, I will likely just lift off the pressure and just lightly shade in those areas. And we will be aiming to make those smooth gradients, but this will happen as we start to slowly build up the layers. This is just the initial base layer where we're just figuring out where the darkest values go first, and then we can work out where those midtones and highlights go as we progress through the layers. So this particular area I'm working on right now is quite difficult because it all looks very dark, but if we take a closer look at the reference image you can see there is subtle differences where the bottom section of the petal here is dark, especially in those corners, and then as we come towards the top in the center it gradually lightens. So we have these smooth and subtle gradients between the values where things get lighter and darker, so that's also important to think about and make sure that we draw in correctly because this will correlate to the shape of the petals and how the light is hitting the flower. So with the relatively light pressure, I'm just continuing to block in this dark shadow here, aiming to create a smooth, even layer of charcoal, only where I can see those shadows the darkest, and then I can move on to drawing in the darkest shadows and details for the surrounding areas. So here we can see where those petals emerge from the center of the rose, things get very dark and in shadow, so I can press a bit harder here and make my lines more opaque to really let that charcoal create that deep dark value. And as we do this throughout the study for those darkest shadowy areas, this is going to really increase that level of contrast and really make this rose pop off the paper once complete. Okay, so I'll now just spend the next minute or so continuing to block in those deepest and darkest values, so pressing harder and letting my marks be more opaque for where the shadows are nearly black on the reference image, and then for some of those smoother gradients and shadows that we can see in the surrounding areas for those dark details, I'll just lift off the pressure and aim to lightly shade in with the charcoal pencil. Things might look a little bit rough at the moment, but we will come to blend this out and work on top in subsequent layers using graphite pencils as well. But for now I'm just filling in these darkest values before we move on to some of the midtones. And I would also just quickly say as I'm drawing in these details that I'm not thinking about drawing a rose, I'm just really breaking things down into their basic shapes and just figuring out the shapes and proportions for the whole area. But I'm not going to worry about any details at this stage. This is just a blocking in stage and we can worry about refining it in future layers towards the end. And again, if you want to watch any part in more detail in real time, you can find that video linked in the description. You can see all along the edge of this petal here we have that deep dark value, and then that gradually fades into a smooth transition to more of a mid-tone. So I can press really hard to start at the edge, and then as I come further into the petal I'll just lift off the pressure and shade in with the pencil rather than pressing too hard. And you can see I've also left some gaps here for some of the lighter mid-tones and highlights as well, because I'm only trying to focus on the darkest values and some of those dark mid-tones. So again, just break things down into their basic shapes, only focus in those darkest areas and leave the lightest areas blank. Okay, so as we work our way into the center of the rose, you can see things get a little bit smaller and our marks have to be even more detailed. So to sharpen the tip of my charcoal pencil, I'm just going to take some sandpaper here, and then I'm simply going to rub the tip back and forth while twisting and turning the pencil. And after doing this a few times, you can see it leaves us with a nice sharp tip, and that just allows us to make sure that we can apply this charcoal only where it's needed. So again, just following the same steps as before, I'm simply breaking the reference down into its basic shapes and proportions and just really aiming to apply that charcoal where I can see those darkest values, and then I'm going to leave those midtones and highlights blank. Again, this is just a blocking in stage, so you don't have to make things look perfect or really neat. At the moment, it's just figuring out where those darker values are, and then we can start to work around the midtones and highlights in layers on top as we work through the piece. So I'm just finishing up with the charcoal pencil here, and you can see I'm holding the pencil quite a bit further back and just letting as much of the side of the tip make contact with the paper, sort of just allowing the pencil to glide along the paper for a light even layer of charcoal. And here I'm simply just using it to create sort of a smoother transition from those darkest shadows at the corners so that we have more of a gradient to where those midtones are going to be. Okay, so now we can start to blend all of this out, and I'm going to use the paper blending stump for this. And the great thing about these is that they have a pointy tip, so we can be quite precise where we blend using this tool. So I'm just starting in this bottom petal here, and again, you only need a light pressure with this, and just to go slowly through the area. Take your time, try not to rush anything, because slow and gradual always makes the best outcomes. So in some of the darker areas, I will press a little bit harder, as that will keep the values quite dark there. And then as we come into some of the more lighter areas, so some of the midtones, as I start to push and blend this charcoal around, I can just ease off that pressure and it will leave a lighter effect. So if you press hard with this tool, you'll get a darker value, and then if you ease off the pressure, the area you're working in will be lighter in comparison. And now as I come into some of the more highlighted areas, as you can see, I'm sort of just pushing and transferring that charcoal into that lighter area. I'm really using hardly any pressure at all, and this is just so that I get the lightest and most even layer of charcoal here. So I don't even need to put any charcoal in this highlighted area. I can simply use the excess that's embedded in the end of this paper stump and sort of just transfer it over to this lighter area. And you can see the effect left behind is a really nice light even layer of charcoal, so it keeps that lighter value in this area. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to this other petal and repeat the same process. So I'm pressing a little bit harder in the corners where it's a bit darker, and then as I come into the middle, I'm easing off the pressure, and I'll continue to do this for all of the other areas as well. And you may notice that as we blend this charcoal out, it does start to look lighter as things get pushed around. So we are losing some of that deep dark value that we put in there in the first place, but that's fine because we can add more charcoal on top in future layers. So don't worry too much about the values getting a little bit lighter when you blend them out, because we can still work in other layers on top as well and just re-enhance those deep dark values for the contrast that we're after in this study. And this is just the way that I like to work personally. So I like to map out all of the values at the start to just give me a good base layer of where generally things are going to go. So where the sections of midtones, highlights and dark values are. So this first initial stage is just figuring out where all of those correct placements are. And then in future layers, I will start to refine that. So start to really think about the different sizes and shapes of the sections. So if some of my highlights or darker areas aren't completely the right shape at the moment, I'm not too worried, because once I've got this first initial base layer all blended out, I can then start to think about refinements and making it more accurate compared to the reference photo. But for now, I'm just trying to get a good starting point to make those refinements on top of. So here you can see the transferring method in full progress. So I haven't got any charcoal in this area, and I'm simply using the excess charcoal that's embedded in the tip of this blending stump, and I'm sort of using it like a pencil to transfer all of this pigment over. So you can see in some of those lighter, more mid-tone areas, you don't even need to put any charcoal down. You can simply just transfer it over with your blending tool. And as long as you keep a light, even pressure, you should create quite a nice smooth base layer, because if you start applying too much pressure and maybe rushing it, then you may find that things look a little bit blotchy. So always keep a light, even pressure and take your time. So as I transfer over more of the embedded charcoal into these new areas, there's gradually going to be less in the tip of the blending stump, so even less of that charcoal is going to be transferred over to the paper, which is perfect for these lighter areas. So again, using a very light pressure, and you can see we have a light, even layer of charcoal in these areas. Okay, so I'm now moving on to this new petal, and I'm going to make the most of the tip now having less charcoal embedded because it's been transferred elsewhere. So I'm going to start in this lighter area to create a light, even mid-tone base, and then I'm going to go over to the shadows. So once that's done, move over to the shadows, and I can again blend out all of this charcoal. And then once the tip of the blending stump has picked up more of the charcoal, I can continue doing the same method of lightly transferring it over to some of those lighter mid-tone and highlighted areas. As you can see, as we come further into the center of the rose, things get smaller and smaller and more detailed, and it does become quite a bit more confusing. So just try to take your time and be gradual where you are transferring all of this charcoal, and keep referring to the reference photo to make sure that you are placing these midtones and darker values in the correct place. Okay, so we are nearing the completion of this initial base layer, and I'm just blending out the last few sections. So just aiming to make everything smoother and more incorporated. So this includes those smooth transitions and gradual gradients between some of the sections. So we don't really want to see any harsh borders between the light and dark values, for example, especially in this small section that I'm working in, or unless it's a petal overlapping another petal, then you can have obviously a sharp border for that. So now that we have those dark values mapped out and in place, what I'm going to do now is take my kneadable eraser. I'm going to mold it into a shape which makes it easy to erase in a more precise area, so sort of a dot. And I'm just going to swipe and dab off some of the excess charcoal that we see in some of those most highlighted areas. And again, this is just increasing that level of contrast, so I want to make sure that our darks are dark enough and our lightest areas are light enough. So these aren't really going to be the final highlights, I just want to make sure that I have that contrast in place moving forward. And then once those lightest values have been erased away, I can then continue using this kneadable eraser just to slightly refine and fix where some of those midtones might be a bit too dark in some areas. So as I said before, I like to do this initial base layer and just keep building upon and refining it as I go forward. So here I'm just very lightly erasing some of the midtones that I've previously put in here to better transition from the highlights to those slightly darker values, because on the reference photo this area is a little bit lighter than what I have on my drawing at the moment. So these are just small corrections I'm making moving forward, and I'm going to do the exact same to some of the other areas as well. So I'm just scouting around and seeing where some of the values are a little bit too dark and need lightening moving forward. So again, I'm only using a light pressure, and I'm sort of just brushing the kneadable eraser tip along where those values need to be lightly lifted off. Okay, so now that my base layer is more refined and slightly corrected, I'm going to go in with my shading pencils. So here I'm using my Pit Graphite Matte, and I'm just going to start in this bottom petal and create a light even layer of graphite on top of that base layer. So again, always a light even pressure for the best, smoothest results. And I'm just going to gradually build upon what I've already got in place. So I'm holding my pencil a bit further back and just shading in to improve upon that base layer that we have. So you can see as we gradually start to build upon the charcoal with our graphite pencil, it's also helping to smooth out the area as well. So things are getting a little bit less grainy and blotchy as the slight paper texture is getting covered by that graphite. So once we have a smoother base layer to work on top of, we can start to think about adding in details on top as well. One of the slightly annoying aspects of a graphite pencil is the shine that you can get from them, especially when trying to create darker values. But the great thing about the Pit Graphite Matte is that they have a much reduced shine to them, so you can achieve those darker values without needing to worry too much about the shiny effect. Okay, so I'm now starting to think about adding in the details on top, and they are very subtle, but you can see some slight texture and dips within the petal here. So in some of the midtones and lighter areas, I can just lightly shade in and add sort of these lines on top to replicate that slight texture that we see in the reference photo. Once I have a few of these marks in place, I can then use my Koh-i-Noor eraser pencil for the highlighted area. And the great thing about this is how precise it can get, being a pencil. So I can use it as a pencil for those lighter areas, and again, as well as erasing some of the excess graphite to lift up the value for those lightest areas, I can also create some texture marks with it as well. So like I did with the pencil, made a few lines and dips in the petal, I can do the same here with my eraser pencil as well. So we have both things going on with the graphite pencil and the eraser pencil working together to create this slight texture that we see in the petal. When I want the eraser pencil to lift off even more of the graphite to create a stronger mark, I find that it helps to almost push it onto the area to sort of create some friction, and this lifts off even more of the graphite just for some of those highlighted details that you want to appear even more brighter. So now switching back to the 2B Pit Graphite Matte Pencil, I'm going to do the same for this petal over here. So shade on top of what I've already got in place. I've already worked out where those darker values and midtones are, so now it's just a matter of fact of building upon that layer, making things look a little bit smoother and just refining the shapes and proportions where all of those values are as well. So again, we've really done the hard work already in that initial base layer, figuring out where everything is to go, and now it's just a matter of refining in layers on top with these graphite pencils. So here I'm just switching back to the eraser pencil, and I would say using a medium pressure here to sort of carve into the background that shape closer I see in the reference photo. So you can see it almost spikes up at the top here, so I can make that slight correction, and then I can continue with this eraser pencil to brighten up this highlighted area even more and sort of make a smoother transition from the highlights to the midtones. And then, as I did with the previous petal, I can create some texture marks on top as well. So within those lighter midtone areas and highlighted areas, I can create some lines on top to replicate those sort of dips that we see in the reference image for this petal. So after making those adjustments with the eraser pencil, I can switch back to using the 2B Pit Graphite Matte and just re-add in where some of those midtones might have been lost, or just to tidy up some of the areas. So for example, here you can see I'm creating smoother transitions and gradients from the darkest value that we see on the edges to those midtones, and also of course adding in more texture on top before moving on to the next petal. And lastly, just finish off using the eraser pencil again, just to create some highlights on top of this area here. So this next method is one I quite like to use often, and this involves taking a small paper stump and wrapping it in a paper towel like so. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a medium pressure and aim to transfer the graphite or charcoal on my drawing onto the paper towel. So the blending stump underneath is just so that we have that detailed tip to make sure that we're putting the paper towel in a precise place that we need it. And by doing this, I'm just slowly and gradually transferring over some of the darker graphite pigment onto that paper towel. So I'm lifting it off my drawing in areas where I think it's a little bit too dark. So you can sort of think of this as erasing the graphite very lightly and gradually. And I just find that this creates a really nice smooth effect compared to erasing. So when I'm using kneadable erasers or the eraser pencil, it can be quite blotchy. So this is quite a slow and gradual way to transfer the graphite from the artwork to the paper towel. And the reason I use a paper towel and not the blending stump itself is because the blending stump is just going to collect all of that graphite and then it's not going to pick up anymore. It's just going to transfer it back to the artwork. So by using the paper towel and continuously shifting it to a clean piece, I can just keep using the paper towel with a medium pressure to pick up that excess graphite. And you'll see what's left behind is a lighter and smoother even finish. So I find this method really works great for achieving not only lighter values but a smoother result as well. So now switching back to the 2B Pit Graphite Matte, I'm going to do the exact same here for this petal. So focusing on those darker midtones that we can see emerging from that dark central shadowy area. And again, really just breaking each reference down into its basic shape and proportions. So I'm not really thinking about drawing a petal here, but I'm just trying to get the correct values in the correct place. So even though this tutorial is sped up, I did really take my time in drawing in these values here. So I'm not rushing anything and I'm making sure that the right values are in the right place. Otherwise, if they're not, we're going to lose that realistic 3D illusion. So as I'm working my way through the study and really aiming to refine and correct the base layer which I already have, here I can notice that this section is a little bit too dark and a little bit blotchy. So you can see I used my eraser pencil to lift off some of that graphite, and then I'm going to go over on top with the blending stump and paper towel method to slightly lift off that graphite even more and just smooth it out as well at the same time. And then once that's done and things are looking a little bit corrected, so smoother and lighter, I can then continue to refining some of the other areas too. So picking up my 2B Pit Graphite Matte pencil again, I'm just correcting the value on this petal where it sort of folds over and overlaps those dark values behind. So we can see at the very edge of this petal, we have that deep dark value, and this transitions into a light mid-tone value as it bends around and falls below. So we need these smooth gradients to achieve that 3D effect of the petal coming out from the dark shadowy area into the light. So I'm drawing in those light mid-tones with my pencil and then blending this out with the paper towel method. So as I mentioned before, the Pit Graphite Matte go all the way up to a 14B grade, which is what I'm using now. So this is the darker pencil of the set, and you can see I have a very sharp tip here, and I'm just using it to darken the shadows slightly, but also to improve the smooth gradients that we see from some of the darker areas into the midtones. So to incorporate these darker values and improve upon what we have here already, I'll be again just using a light even pressure just to gradually build up that layer. So as I continue to refine the values in each of the petals, I can notice that this small section here needs to be lighter to better match the reference photo. So I'm just going to go on top with a light to medium pressure using the Kohinoor eraser pencil just to lift off that excess graphite and relighten that value. And then I can do the same for some of the surrounding petals as I start to compare and contrast the completed values in place. So I'll just continue asking myself questions such as, is this area lighter or darker than this area, or is this shadow in the complete correct place, and so on. Here I'm also just using the eraser pencil to create those highlights that we see at the tip of each petal where it's just catching the light, as these have gotten a bit lost when shading in some of the mid-tones and lighter areas. So I'm just re-enhancing these areas and making sure they are light as we see them in the reference image. And then of course, if I notice any texture marks, I can do the paper towel blending method just to soften and reincorporate those pigments together. But of course, if you don't need to make these corrections, as you've already drawn it in perfectly correctly the first time, then that's fine. You don't need to worry about any of these steps, but I thought I would just include showing you these small corrections I make throughout, just because it's my personal way of working, simply because I start with a rough base layer and then make refinements on top as I go along. But of course, this is just one method of any. I'm not saying that you need to draw this way or use these methods and techniques, but if you're drawing in lots of layers like I am, then hopefully you find it helpful. So as you can see, I've picked up my 2B Pick Graphite Matte and I'm simply going to draw on top of the layers here, as I haven't yet shaded in using a pencil for these specific areas. So again, just going on top of the corrected base layer to further refine and enhance some of those midtones and lighter areas. So for some of the slightly darker midtones, I can just go over the area a few more times, press a little bit harder, and the area will be slightly darker. And then for the lighter areas, just ease off that pressure even more and maybe go over it less amount of times so that we have that lighter value in place. So I would say at this stage, I'm really thinking about those gradients where the shadows go from a darker value to a lighter value. So slowly drawing in careful layers to make those smooth gradients will help to achieve what we see in the reference photo. And of course, as we come further into this rose, it does get quite detailed and busy. So I would highly recommend having a sharp pencil tip here. Okay, so switching back to the 14B Picked Graphite Matte, I'm going to continue in this area with that nice sharp tip and maybe not have to press as hard, as this pencil is a very dark grade anyway, but again, just keep reinforcing those shadows and building up the definition and contrast within the area. So a lot of this middle part of the rose still has to be defined, so all I'm doing is looking back and forth the reference photo and my drawing and just seeing where those darkest values are. So again, I'm not really thinking about drawing a rose, but just breaking things down into their basic shapes and proportions, and then once those darkest lines and details are in place, I can go in with some lighter shading pencils and create those smooth transitions and gradients for the shadows coming out into the midtones and then the highlights. And all of this works together to produce the 3D image that we see in front of us. So this particular petal I'm working on here is a bit of a strange one because it's pointed directly towards the camera. So you can see the center has that mid-tone, whereas both of the sides have those highlighted edges. So again, just break things down into their basic shapes and then derive the values from that so that you don't get too confused here, because there is a lot going on in this area. And then immediately next to the highlighted edge, we have that petal behind, which has those slightly darker midtones. So it's important we get these in place as well, because then that highlighted edge is going to look lighter in comparison to it. So the dark petal behind is given the depth to those highlights in front. Okay, so now just switching to the 2B Pick Graphite Matte, and I'm just going to add in some very light midtones here to the petal that we see coming out in front. So it is quite highlighted, but it's not as highlighted as some other areas. So I do need a slight midtone here. And then once that's in place, I can then take my Koh-i-Noor eraser pencil and just create some highlight marks on top for some of the slight texture that we see as well. So again, just picking up my 2B Pick Graphite Matte to further enhance the midtones on this specific petal now. And as you can tell, as we're coming to the end of the study, it's all about those small refinements and changes just to better match the reference photo as we see it. So as I've mentioned before in some of my other videos, I really like to work with graphite every now and then because it brings things down to the basics, so all you have to really think about are the details and the values without any color to worry about. You just only really have to think about how light or dark an area is. So even if you're not a graphite artist, so for me personally, I mostly work in soft pastels, I do think it's great to do some studies every now and then in graphite just to strengthen your skills when it comes to those values. And because you only need a very few tools and materials, it's quite easy and accessible. So for example, if I'm on a trip or visiting family, I will often take a sketchbook with some graphite pencils just to keep my artistic mind active, and I find that this really helps to practice every now and then just to keep the relevant skills fresh in my mind, and then when I go back to my studio and I can begin working in soft pastels or oil paints, then I won't feel so rusty coming back after some time. So I'm pretty happy with what I've got here so far. I would say that all of the petals are mostly drawn in, and again it's just about adding those final refinements on top. So here I am with the 14B Pit Graphite Matte, and mostly with a very light pressure, just going over some areas to redarken some of the midtones. I'll also strengthen some of those details as well in the dark shadowy areas, but at the very end I will come back with a charcoal pencil to really strengthen those deepest and darkest values, and then that's going to contrast very nicely with the lighter midtones and highlights that we have in the rows here to give us this nice, really contrasted study that contains a lot of depth and dimension. Continuing with the refinements, I'll also do the same with the Koh-i-Noor eraser pencil just to strengthen some of the lighter midtones and also the highlights as well. In this specific area here, I can notice that the midtone is far too dark, so I'll just continue with the eraser pencil to lightly lift off the excess graphite and charcoal within this area, and then to remove all of the blotchy textured marks left behind from the eraser pencil, I'll again use that paper towel wrapped around the blending stump method. And as you can see, that softens things up while also lightening it a little bit as well. So again, just really emphasizing that you only need to focus on the specific values within an area, so you don't need to think about drawing a petal necessarily. But here you can see it's a bit confusing where the middle of this section is slightly darker than the inner area, so it's this play of light that we have to get correct. And you can see this same lighter value in some of the other areas as well. So just because the petal is going down into the shadowy area, depending on where it is, doesn't necessarily mean it gets darker, because it could get lighter in some places. And here I'm just strengthening this little detail where you can see the petal bends over, creating this darker shadow line that runs through the middle. Okay, so now for the very final details to finish this study off, I'm again picking up my charcoal pencil, and for the last time I'm going to go over those darkest areas to strengthen them. As you can see, graphite can layer on top of charcoal pretty well, and charcoal can also do the same on multiple layers of graphite. So I'm still using a light pressure here, and I'm just looking back and forth the reference photo and my drawing and just seeing where those darkest details and values are, and simply placing the charcoal in those areas. And depending on whether I want a more opaque mark or something which is a little bit more subtle, I can adjust my pressure according to what the different areas need. So if I'm pressing hard, I'm going to create a nice strong opaque line, and then if I ease off that pressure, it should only just apply a subtle amount of charcoal. So that now concludes this beginner's graphite and charcoal rose study tutorial. I hope you're able to take away some useful graphite. Anyway, that's now the end of this rose study tutorial and this video here on YouTube. I really hope this video has been helpful for you, and if it has, please consider liking and subscribing, as it really helps my channel out a lot. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Before you go, you're more than welcome to pick up my brand new beginner graphite and charcoal guide for completely free. I hope you find it useful.